Welcome, everybody. Appreciate you joining us today for Metalogix and IT Unity's No Limit Storage in SharePoint 2016 Play the Winning Hand. My name is Paul LaPorte, and I'm the Director of Product Marketing here at Metalogix for our backup and storage products. And what I wanted to share with you today are some insights based around both the experience in cloud and business continuity that I've spent quite a few years working in, as well as some of the ongoing changes that we continue to see coming out of Microsoft, particularly in the area of storage and how that's going to impact a lot of the things that you're doing moving forward. As a little bit of background, previously I've done quite a bit of work in the IT space, in the SaaS space, around bringing different mission critical applications like SharePoint either to market or making them bulletproof. And that's one of the things that we want to do with SharePoint. SharePoint has become mission critical for everyone, and we want to make sure that it is bulletproof and we don't have those hidden gotchas. So for today, a couple of things to note. We are going to have an opportunity for you to be involved with the webinar today. There's several opportunities to participate in some polling questions. Now the polling questions are here for your benefit, the group's benefit, because it gives us an opportunity to surface some questions that really help us to understand what our peer group is doing within key aspects of managing SharePoint. And a lot of times having data points about what other people are doing and some of the trends and best practices allows us to both improve what we do internally in our organizations, but also then to make business cases if we want to solicit and secure budget for some upgrades and improvements that we've earmarked for our environment. So with that, we're going to go ahead and drop in, and when we get to the poll questions, we'll expose those to you. I have a partner in crime here. Lyman will be helping me to run things in the back end and possibly answer questions that you may have in your chat window. But we will turn on the polling questions. We'll let you know they're there, and we'll drop into things. So let's go ahead and get started with No Limit Storage in SharePoint 2016. Now, as many of you know, and may have been fortunate enough to go to Ignite out in Chicago recently, you may have seen some previews of what 2016 was about. And what I've done is collected a variety of comments from some of the key people at Microsoft that lends some extra color to where Microsoft might be evolving SharePoint, particularly on premises, but also based on its experiences in the cloud. So Julie White, for those of you who aren't familiar, is the product manager, general manager for the Office suite. And what she has noted it is several things. We're going to be seeing a lot more focus around experience, user experience, manageability, giving you the right tools to manage in this evolving type of a space, particularly as we get into hybrid, as we'll hear a lot more about. And then extensibility. Now, one of the things that is integrating or creating opportunity to integrate and do some of our first forays into on-prem and the cloud is this whole thing around OneDrive. And OneDrive is a great opportunity to use for storage in cross-platform and cross-OS scenarios. We're also going to see a lot more around search, more personalized search, and then a lot of focus on hybrid management. As you can imagine, as you transition into the cloud, whether you are taking little steps going in a hybrid way, maybe you do an extranet in O365 and keep the rest of your deployments on site, or you jump all the way into the cloud, there are a whole bunch of different factors that we're going to have to consider, and Julia continues to point these out. She also notes that we're going to see an ever-expanding set of APIs and software developer kits that are being made available to help third parties and to help Microsoft customers to bridge the gap between on-premise and the cloud. We've already seen a lot of that as some new developments in migration tools, migration APIs have become available to really speed up what was being a bottleneck in the ability for many of you to get to the cloud, because just moving that much data in traditional ways was somewhat problematic. Now, this is a architecture slide that Microsoft had put out there, but it does help to explain the new emphasis on managing hybrid deployments and the areas that we're going to that will make the transition from where we are today to O365 or to managing in a hybrid way. We see a lot of different things that they're doing here. It's just a little snippet, but it does show this actually was something that predates Ignite by quite a bit, but they held true to that at all of the different sessions. And what we see is a lot around Delve and a lot around analytics and some of the other capabilities that are going to be becoming more visible to many of us. Now, Bill Bayer, one of my favorite guys over at Microsoft, their senior product manager, who's been around forever, you notice the highlight of key things here. One is he uses the word hybrid a tremendous amount of times. We're focused on hybrid and the evolution of hybrid, and using things like Azure become more important strategically. Okay, so all of these different things give us insight into where he's focused, where his engineers and product managers are focused. And when we look at what the broad spectrum of Microsoft executives started to talk up at WPC 14, is that hybrid is the chosen path. 3/4 of the companies out there have said that's the way that they're going to move to the cloud, not pure deployment to O365. And that actually has dropped as people start to realize there's too many limitations and they need some flexibility and customization capabilities than they would ordinarily get. So this one is one of the things that starts to get us into the storage arena and give us a little bit of insight. Now, 2016, as Bill pointed out, was the very first time that Microsoft has had experience running SharePoint at scale. Kind of funny considering that there's 60, 70,000 different companies and organizations out there using it, but this is their first hands-on experience. And what Office 365 has afforded them is an opportunity to understand that there's a lot of unique operational things going on when you work at scale. You start to bump into limits that you previously only thought about in an academic sense. Now they're, from an operational perspective, having to solve them. So Microsoft, in order to manage Office 365 as an incredibly large deployment of SharePoint, has started to add some things in there. Now, one of the things that they have done is they've changed a little bit about realizing how they're going to deal with these very large storage situations, and they're actually moving stuff off. So they've come up with the equivalent of an RBS solution to externalize content. We'll learn a little bit more about that as we get into today's session. Now, storage is one of those things that's part of what you're used to operating and managing as administrators. Now, as we move into the cloud or into hybrid scenarios, this starts to change. Note across the different kinds of deployment options how storage starts to fall outside the IT stack that the administrator manages. Now, this can be a welcome relief, but it also may introduce new types of limits or changes that need to be understood. Anytime you change the process by which you're managing things, it introduces opportunity for error, and it introduces opportunities for downtime, and we want to avoid those as much as possible. So what does this mean for storage? So that brings us into kind of the context of today's session, which is, what are the learning objectives? Well, the first thing is, what we're going to discuss is SharePoint and what creates problems within SharePoint. Next thing that we're going to deal with is SharePoint and its limitations. It has many limitations, from hard boundaries to soft or recommended or operational performance limits. And we'll review how to map those limits to your organization and select a handful of the most prevalent limits that you're going to encounter and see how these will evolve in 2016 and in the cloud. And this gives you great insight to be able to start to plan ahead for some of the things that you're going to need to make changes for. Then what we're going to look at is no limit storage. And what I mean by that is what we want is to achieve an environment not shackled by limits. And we're going to look at the common root cause of many limits and take a look at how we can use known technology to eliminate those limits. And then lastly, we're going to arm you with a set of tools and an action plan for what you can do next. Now, if we take a look at how SharePoint limitations have evolved over time, back in 2007, there was a scant 9 pages of noted limits around the product. These were things that you might bump into. But SharePoint's evolved, it's gotten more complex. You've added workflows, you've added third-party apps, things that you've custom built on top. And Microsoft started to identify and hear from its customer base about new limits that were being encountered. So when they documented for 2010, it was double that. It was up to 18 pages. Fast forward to 2013, and it was up to a full 25 pages. So you can see, as you push the bounds of what this product or platform can do, you start to run into different things that are going to bite at you at various times. And we want to avoid those as much as possible. So what does that mean for us in 2016? Well, we can expect more complexity, we can expect higher limits, and what are the specific things before they release it that we can probably infer that guides us into, if we're doing planning around architectural growth and managing content, what do we think that we can deal with? So the first thing I wanted to do is present an overview of the types of limits you deal with that impact your storage operations, your strategy and architecture. And as you see, many of the limits are technical, but an equal number are business driven, things that are outside your control, but for which you have to adapt the solution. I've selected 5 to focus on for this session that span technical and business issues, some that are internal and under your control, and others which are externally driven, but for which you need to be able to respond. So why are limits so painful and prevalent? Well, quite simply, content growth drives a majority of SharePoint problems. Without growth, we wouldn't need to evolve our backup and storage approaches, and SharePoint would not become as mission critical as it does for many organizations because people wouldn't be adopting it. You also throw in their governance and compliance, and those would be less pressing issues. But content growth happens, and as a majority, it triggers a lot of our limit discussions for today. So this brings us to our first limit, which is around content database size. As databases grow, we reach pain points associated with 1, performance cliffs, 2, hardware failures, and then 3, manageability issues as you must move content around and create database sprawl to allow for content growth. And what we're looking at here is just a representative. This one was taken from 2007, but the shape of the curve doesn't change drastically no matter what the version and no matter which performance impact you're looking at. Basically, it says if you have more documents, more files, as you add more into a system, your response rate goes down until it not flatlines, but it becomes untenable. And that's what we're seeking to avoid. We want to find ways of allowing you to grow and keep that performance at a high level despite larger databases. So now, once organizations, one reason organizations need to limit or to optimize their storage is the sheer volume of it and the staggering pace at which it's growing. So global data is expected to go up to a staggering 1.2 trillion gigabytes in 2015 or in 2010, but grow all the way up to 35 trillion gigabytes by 2020. And this is a growth rate of over 65% year over year. it's not just about the volume of content, but also the nature of that content that's going to present a variety of challenges. So as more data is going in, how are we going to manage that data effectively? So what can we expect? Well, 2013 saw Microsoft acknowledge in a backhanded way the need for larger content databases. So Microsoft adjusted. They went from recommending a 200 gigabyte database limit to acknowledging databases up to 4 terabytes if you have the right architecture, if you have the right IOPS performance. And while 4 terabytes might seem impractical for most organizations, it shows that there was enough pressure on Microsoft to raise it as an issue, and we're going to start to see this in these new limits. Now, however, reading the details on this also shows an acknowledgement that you, besides a lot of extra IOPS, which is pretty expensive when you add servers and SQL licenses and everything to that, there's an acknowledgement of RBS, Remote Blob Store, as the path to gain a 20x increase in the maximum database size. So more recently, Microsoft has experienced running SharePoint at scale in O365, and the chatter is substantially higher with respect to managing large environments. The O365 team has developed a specialized RBS tool to manage this high volume of blobs in O365. But by the way, this is not FileStream if anybody is thinking along those lines. I expect to hear much more emphasis around RBS as a chosen vehicle to manage your growing SharePoint environments. So that's going to bring us to our first poll. Lyman, if you wouldn't mind opening this up to everyone. And that is, what is the size of your largest database? We all might have databases that we keep in check for the majority of them, but somewhere out there you have the largest, and it might be small, it might be under 100 gigabytes, it might be 100 to 200 or 2 to 500. This 500 to a terabyte. Maybe you don't know, or maybe you have a very large database because you have a lot of video files or other type of assets that are sitting out there. So, when we look at this, even with that 4 terabyte limit noted by Microsoft in 2013, it's still a 200 gigabyte limit noted for normal operations. So they haven't shifted that. They've just said that if you throw a bunch of extra hardware and IOPS and externalized stuff, you can get larger. So we'll go ahead and I think I'm going to broadcast the results here now. And Lyman, if I've done that correctly, great. If not, please expose it for me. So what we have is, we look at this. The recommended limit of 200 gigabytes or less had 0 responses. So what does that tell us? Out of today's poll, out of today's group of people, 100% of you are already over the recommended limit for all normal operations. 57% of you, almost 3 in 5, are in that 200 to 500, not 3,500 hopefully, gigabyte range. And then we have kind of an even split out there. We've got an eighth of you who are out there at that 500 to a terabyte, another eighth of you that are greater than a terabyte, and then about the same percentage that don't quite know. So let's go ahead and in that poll we'll move on. But it's very interesting when you have this number of people who are saying, we've got a lot of content. It's getting hard to manage. What do we do with it? So this is why we're seeing Microsoft responding and why we're moving towards much higher limits in 2016. So there's some exciting stuff that's starting to take place. Second limit that we want to look at today is around large file types. So what's the biggest thing that contributes to these large database sizes? Typically, it's large file types, not large volumes. Now, that's not always the case, but the big thing that's driving the heavy lift here comes with new file types that are multimedia in nature. So we deal with a hard limit of 2 gigabytes. Okay, this has been something that's been a challenge for quite a while. It's a SQL-induced challenge, but many industries need these large file types. Everything from the entertainment community to hospitals and medical companies. security and surveillance, engineering, CAD companies, all of these different industries, as well as our own. We're a technology vendor, but we've got a marketing team, and that marketing team uses video to do a variety of things. Those are large file types. Now, down in the bottom, what you actually see are some examples. If you happen to be, let's say that you're a parent and you've got kids and you've got Disney films at home. If you have the new release of Sleeping Beauty, guess what? That is a 5 gigabyte file, that single file. Okay, you wouldn't be able to store that or manage that if you were wanting to put that into Microsoft, into SharePoint. If you were doing some of these cat and pet scans and other types of imaging, you can have those going up to 40 gigabytes and beyond. And then if you're putting up a high-end commercial building and you've got complex CAD drawings, it can be all over the map, but definitely very, very large file types that you're trying to store. And traditionally, people have had to leave these out there in file shares that aren't managed, aren't searchable, aren't part of the infrastructure and the benefit that comes with SharePoint. So what can we expect around larger file sizes? The boundary restrictions in SQL Server most likely will continue, and internal SharePoint capabilities remain the same, but something is changing. We have a high degree of confidence that this 2 gigabyte limit is going to go up. Now, we don't know if it's going to originate in SQL Server 2014 or beyond. We don't know if it's driven by some other change in the way that they are shredding and reassembling. But the bottom line is high degree of confidence that we're going to see this 2 gigabyte limit jump up to 10 gigabytes. Now, that is great. You can now manage stuff inside of SharePoint that are very large file types. But let me throw the asterisk in there. Do you want to manage 10 gigabyte files inside of SharePoint? A couple of reasons. The API for users to be able to call and get that file sent to them is incredibly slow for unstructured stuff. So you take a very large file limit, 2 gigabytes, now bump it up to 10. People are going to be waiting a very, very long time for that file to get to them. There's a lot better options for both performance and in manageability and backup and stuff like that by keeping those large files out. So even though the file size limit is going up, there's a big caveat of, buyer beware. You may not want to test that system because it's going to hit you in a lot of different ways. Now, OneDrive, why do we think this? OneDrive is based on SharePoint. Okay? Yet SQL Server continues to have this 2 gigabyte limit. So you got this kind of conundrum here. But we know that the cloud first initiative is driving the changes. OneDrive, you can drop 10 gigabyte files in there. Hybrid deployments may start to take advantage of these increased file types. And so we're likely to see a change, and most likely it's going to be through the same underlying technology that OneDrive is enabling to store these kinds of limits. So that brings us to our second poll here. So Lyman, if you would be so kind to push this out, and that is, do you have any files in your organization greater than 2 gigabytes? Not in SharePoint, because I know unless you are already using an externalization tool like StoragePoint by Metalogix that externalizes all of this using RBS, you may have these sitting out there in file shares, but you just can't figure out how to get them in. So this is one of those things where there's the way that your environment is today and what kind of content you have. And then if you go out there and talk to the business unit, talk to the users, the prime users of your system, what their future plans are, I can probably, with a high degree of certainty, know that if you have a marketing team, they're probably going there. If you have engineering teams, they probably have some pretty large files as well. So we'll go ahead and I'm going to broadcast the results out to everyone. And by a 2-to-1 margin, 63% of you have 2 gigabyte files or greater. That means that 2/3 of you have content that ideally you could be managing and securing with and making available for collaboration and other activities within SharePoint, and you can't. unless you're using an RBS tool. Okay, so some of you may already be using that. But that's a big number, and that number will only grow. It'll only get larger. So when we look at that, that's another limit that we really would like to be able to relieve based on just the behavior of the types of content in our system. So let's go ahead and exit out of that poll. And we're going to take a look at a concept here. Concept is recovery point objective. Recovery point objective is one of two main attributes that you may be monitoring related to backups and business continuity and disaster recovery. Recovery point objective, quite simply, is what is the maximum amount of content changes that you are willing to put at risk, so that if you have an oops, between backup periods where the system goes down, or you have a bad backup that's taken and you can't recover it, what's the maximum amount you're willing to risk within the organization? Usually, this is a mutually determined number. You may be able to come to the table and talk about what is technically feasible, and your users usually come to the table and tell you what they need, what their pain tolerance is, and you negotiate. And if you need a better RPO because your users are pushing you for it, you might need to go back and ask for more budget. But you need to be able to justify it. So this is a good collaborative way to determine that recovery point. Now, SharePoint's getting more mission critical. More users are using it for more of their job. RPOs should be dropping, but growing content and growing activity on it usually tends to push that up. And larger databases take longer to back up, which means we have a harder time, keeping these RPOs in check. Quite simply, the goal is to have the smallest RPO possible. Now, backups are the biggest cause for missing RPOs. So let's look at an example here and discuss some of Microsoft's best practices. First off, Microsoft recommends not using out-of-the-box backup tools for content databases that are greater than 200 gigabytes due to risk of missing backup windows and recovery point objectives. Now let's return back to that first polling question. What percentage of you have at least one database that's greater than 200 gigabytes? Everyone. Wow, okay. So Microsoft just says, don't use the backup tools, everyone. That are coming out of the box. This means that there has to be alternative ways to do backups that make it faster. And so that these RPOs and other metrics like recovery time objectives on the recovery side, and then as you get into service level agreements within a hybrid world, you can start to hit these things. Now, Microsoft tested native SharePoint and SQL backup and was able to back up only about 600 gigabytes in 6 hours using a high-end server. Now, in my opinion, 600 gigabyte database is smaller than a typical SharePoint farm these days. Yeah, you may have multiple databases and stuff, but it puts it into a common reference here. Microsoft even states that if you're using out-of-the-box techniques, limit your content database size to 100 gigabytes, and site collection backup should not be anything larger than 85 gigabytes. That means you can't granularly restore content reliably if a site collection is too large. It's because the process is too resource intensive and will just flat out take too long. So the example that I like to use here is around, we've benchmarked at backing up a terabyte database. We get a little bit better performance with just normal tools of around 8 hours. Now, your particular environment, it might be 5, it might be 12. But the key point is, if you have a recovery point objective of a half of a business day, 4 hours, you've already exceeded that SLA on average by 4 hours. So you've doubled up what is stated was your maximum allowable amount of data lost. So how do we deal with that? And how is storage related to all of this? So let's take a look at limit number 3, which is around backups. Now, out of the box, we just talked about that. We have this misalignment of a terabyte equals 8 hours and 4 hours equals one of the, kind of the numbers that we see recurring again and again. The big thing is once you hit a point of no return, once your backups are taking longer than your RPO, there really is no going back. And we're dealing with Microsoft imposed limits, business continuity and performance limits, and limits due to unforeseen backup failures, something that testing will expose. Which brings us to a question around backups. And this is just kind of putting my disaster recovery and business continuity hat on. Are your backups tested? I've run quite a few surveys at this point, well over 1,000 companies, and talking about, are your SharePoint backups ever tested? And to a very high degree, the answer is no. We take them, and then if we use them, we kind of cross our fingers and hope that the backup was good. And then we have some tools that maybe there's some diagnostic or reporting tools that tell us, yeah, we think it's good. But the reality is, until you get in there and test backups, a lot of things are not necessarily exposed. So I would highly, highly encourage you to test backups. And this starts to become problematic as you move into a hybrid or cloud world because Microsoft controls the backups. That's a whole nother story, and we're gonna touch the tip of that iceberg here in a moment. But it's an important thing to understand that backups, which oftentimes in an organization, you know, half of you might be using or doing your own backups, and half of you might be relying on an enterprise backup team. There's who do you call for that enterprise backup? How long does it take for them to get it? If it's Microsoft in the cloud, you know, it takes a couple of days, and that typically isn't good enough if you're trying to shoot for you know, a quick RTO, a recovery time objective on something. So what can we expect from backups and storage as we look to 2016? Well, first of all, there's no indication of change in native SharePoint or SQL backup. There's no talk, no high-level discussion alluding to change. So from a backup perspective, it is what it is. I would expect to see no changes coming out of that. Now, I said something about O365. They have a fixed backup policy. There is no customization. They're taken every 12 hours. They're retained for 14 days, and you have no direct access to those backup files. So what does that mean? If you have a policy of maintaining backups for 30 days, 90 days, if you're in an organization that has to maintain them longer, a year, 3 years, 7 years, if you're a healthcare, financial services, pharmaceutical company, a lot of different organizations, in fact, pretty much everybody I know has a retention period for maintaining backups longer than 14 days. That's 2 weeks. And you don't even have access to them. Now, you'll continue SQL Server is still going to present some backup challenges. This is not going to change. You're going to add more content. You're still going to have to back those up. So what you're going to need to do, plan on augmenting. Plan on that you're going to have to put third-party tools of some type out there if you are going purely to the cloud or into a hybrid scenario to make sure that your backups conform to your policies to achieve things like governance, RPOs and RTOs, these kinds of things. Expect no change to the core SharePoint capabilities. You got to look outside of that. And if you are one of these companies that are moving to the cloud a little bit, and you're starting to test things out, we've got a great cloud backup tool that gives you departmental level backups so that, you know, if let's say the HR team wanted to back up its core high priority content, it could do that, store it offsite. It could store it in Azure, it could store it you know, on its own departmental level servers, and then access that in a time of need without having to have SharePoint instance up and running. Okay, now you've really empowered people and you give them a lot of confidence that if you move to the cloud, they're not going to be impacted no matter what happens, because there's always new things when you go to the cloud. So let's go ahead and move to our next poll here. Lyman, please pop up the one on how long does your SharePoint backup take? And I would love to get a feel for how frequently, and I know this is going to vary because, you know, some of you may say, well, is it a full backup or an incremental or a differential? You know, what I like to think of is At some point, you're going to take a full backup. How long does that take? That's always a good measure. But if you're continually taking one of the other types, that's okay too. Just note it down. We're just trying to get a feel for how long is the process, and if something goes wrong during one of these processes, what's your remedy, and are you prepared to deal with certain kinds of things that eventually will come to pass. Now, while you guys are answering that, I'll just let you know there's a set of assets that I've put together freely available for you around preparing a successful or foolproof backup and recovery plan for SharePoint. And there's a lot of things that you can do in and around storage and backups. There's some great checklists. There's a step-by-step guide on how to literally over a lunch hour, get a framework of a backup plan if you don't have one of those today. And I encourage you to go out there to the Metalogix website and just search on backup and recovery. There's some recorded webinars. There's just a whole bunch of things that may make your life a whole lot easier if this is something that you're a little bit new to. So let's take a look at the results here. And what we see is that 50% of you fall into that 4 to 8 hour range. That's where the majority of the industry is. 25% down in that 1 to 4 hour, and that's pretty good. That, especially if it happens to be a full, most likely those are some differentials or incremental backups we're talking about. But you may also have high availability solutions in place to make sure that those are very quick snapshots, or you're replicating in real time, things of that nature. 1/8 of you are out there over 8 hours, and then some of you don't know. And I would, interestingly enough, the don't know, there's nothing wrong with the don't know answer as long as you can find out. And the don't know usually means it's not directly in your area of responsibility. Often that's out in an enterprise backup group taking these. And it's a great thing to do. Find out who's in charge of taking backups for SharePoint. Go meet them for coffee, or if they happen to be in a different location, call them up, have a Skype session, something like that with them, and basically find out, are they taking them, how frequently, what's the way that they check the validity of those backups, and just make sure you have all of that, because someday you're going to need to call that person. You want to know who it is, what their contact number is, and what's the process by which they can provide you with those backups. So let's go ahead and close this one out. And we'll take a look at our fourth limit here. Our fourth limit is around compliance. This is starting to get out of the technology arena into the externally driven mandates. Compliance isn't something that we usually get a choice on. Somebody outside the organization, maybe it's at the board level, senior management, maybe it's just regulatory instilled. You have need for longer term storage. Or you have a board that says your RPO will be X, and you need to move this content onto a worm drive, whether it's hardware or software based, so that it is non-editable. It stands up to an auditing check, things of that nature. Or you have archiving policies that you want to adhere to. And so there's fundamentally a need to move content to more appropriate storage tiers that are outside and away from SharePoint. So how do you do that? Well, the native architecture is it stays all in SharePoint. So fundamentally, we've got to move a lot of this content to a different place. Now, this is called leveraging the right storage. And choose where your content is stored, because not all content is created equal, and you have to go in there and be proactive and prioritize your content. Maybe by category. You can set up rules so things are automatically done, but segment your content based on priority, service level, even backup content more frequently than other content by keeping important stuff on higher speed storage. Move secondary content onto secondary cheaper tiers. There may be those regulatory requirements that require you to store it for activities like e-discovery. and leverage the right storage for the particular content, which is something that you can't do out of the box today. That lifecycle management, manage your content proactively as it ages through the various tiers. And the image that you're looking at here basically shows an example of if you have a file, in this case, maybe it's a Word file, and you keep the metadata about the Word file and the Word file in SQL Server. Well, now if you externalize, you move the blob, or that actual unstructured object, the Word document, out to SAN or NAS, or a CAS environment, or even out into the cloud. And what you get from this is appropriate storage that is cheaper, because today SQL sits on a SAN type of device, which is very expensive both for the hardware and the licenses for the software. Now, it has the advantage of being accessible very quickly and with high frequency. So for content that's like that, you make sure that you leave the blobs on a SAN, and you write a rule for such. But maybe as the frequency of interaction with that content dwindles and the number of people touching it dwindles, or the age of it, you can automatically move that content out to NAS, or maybe you offload it out into Azure or Amazon or someplace else. But the automated rules come in handy, because once you set this up within your environment, it's like fire and forget. You don't have to necessarily go back in and proactively manage all the time. But it saves you money, it increases performance of the system, it gets rid of a lot of the clutter, and it gives you a lot more flexibility in how you want to work with your environment. So what can you expect as far as compliance goes? Well, this is going to remain a big business issue, especially for archivings and record retention. Now, O365 has some provisions for e-discovery and legal hold, but nothing about long-term retention. So expect no storage point changes for compliance with respect to storage. Now, the business and regulatory requirements can only realistically be achieved through externalization. So if you are one of these kinds of companies that does have compliance, governance, regulatory issues around your content, and you need to archive, you need to store, you need to be able to put legal holds on it and stuff, you gotta move it outside. You have to look at these kind of things. So that's one of the things that if you don't have it today, this is a great solution. It's been proven over a very long period of time that lowers your risk, lowers your cost, and gives you the ability to meet those business requirements that fundamentally drive a lot of stuff that you're doing. Now that brings us to limit number 5, cloud strategy. And you might be scratching your head saying, how is this a limit? Why is this in here? Well, let's look at it from the point of view, cloud is something, it's a business and IT force, and it's not going away. Fundamentally, if you don't figure out how to take advantage of the cloud within your organization and the key drivers of your environment, you're going to lose out. You're going to miss out on the flexibility and economies that come with that. But how can you deal with some of these things? Well, storage is one of the rate limiting factors. If you try to move a 5 terabyte environment up to the cloud, it's going to take a really long time. If you have to back up all of that information for whatever purposes and move it to another cloud provider or back down to a disaster recovery site at one of your facilities, it takes a really long time. So there's considerations here. That's why I call it a limit. It's a huge opportunity, but you have to factor in the issues that you're going to be contending with around storage into that decision and your architecture primarily. So understanding just at a high level, what are a couple of key things? Well, when you're on premise, as we all start out, you have full hardware control. You can size and scale as needed. You can mix and match to create your own high availability or disaster recovery scenario. You get total flexibility and customization around SharePoint. A lot of great things, but it tends to be fairly costly to manage as you grow over time. Second thing is, as you move up to perhaps a managed in the cloud, managed by you, but you put it out there on a dedicated instance in Azure, it's still pretty expensive relative to some of the other cloud alternatives, but it gives you total control of still that customization and flexibility, but it gives you the ability now to use maybe the infrastructure of like the large providers to gain geodiversity and some of the other things that are important in managing a world-class a platform for something that's mission critical. Now you look at going up to the cloud in terms of like O365, a full SaaS offering. Okay, you get great high availability across multiple data centers, you get fault tolerance. You can scale on demand in no time. So if you buy a company or you have seasonal demands of partners and retail, whatever it happens to be, and you need to burst up, you can. It's self-provisioning, it's low cost, but you're going to give up control. As long as you understand that your environment doesn't need a lot of flexibility, a lot of customization, the cloud can be a great option for you. If you have a lot of customizations, you're going to have to look at some hybrid or staying on premise to solve that. So storage limitations as business issues. Fundamentally, storage within SharePoint requires the most expensive type of storage. It gives you very slow uploads and downloads. Now, from your user experience perspective, when they go to search and you're doing it, it's generating new search indexes. When you are just making, what's the most prevalent thing a user does? I'm going to go into SharePoint, I'm going to access a document, I'm going to make a call and pull it down to my local device, I'm going to open it up, I'm going to make changes, and I'm going to upload it. That is very slow within SharePoint. SharePoint and SQL Server were never designed to handle unstructured information. It was a transaction processing image. It was something that it was designed to move a lot of records and transactions very quickly through it, not large unstructured content that it needed to bring over a piece at a time and then present to a user. And those big unstructured documents then cause the backups and delays that we've been talking about. So fundamentally, you want to figure out how you can take advantage of moving stuff outside of SharePoint. So what to expect from a cloud strategy perspective? Hybrid deployments and integrated management are going to be the two biggest items that we see out of SharePoint 2016. Microsoft has seen the writing on the wall and realizes people aren't going en masse to O365. They've downgraded their assessments, but they've upgraded those who are using both. And they know that if you're using both, you want, as much as possible, equivalent functionality, equivalent integrated management dashboards and capabilities, not having to learn and keep track of two separate sets of processes and ways of doing things. So expect massive change there. And there's going to be many impacts to storage there because you want to access all of your storage from anywhere. Doesn't matter if it's in the cloud or an on-premise, no matter where your users are coming from. That brings us to our next poll, which is, do you plan to move any content to the cloud in the next 12 months? And so let's go ahead and open this poll up. Maybe you already have. Great. Maybe you have plans to do so. Maybe you don't. Or maybe you don't know. So let's go ahead and think through. And it doesn't matter if it's SharePoint content today. This is more about how your organization is behaving and if they're going to be moving stuff up there. Now keep in mind, content can be not high priority content that individuals move up to OneDrive. It could be the unsanctioned EFSS environment where people are moving up to Box and Google and Dropbox, and it's already happening, and you're like, I got to get a handle on this. How am I going to do that? So let's take a quick look. It looks like most of our votes in. So I'm going to go ahead and push this out by a pretty wide majority. Most of you, 57, 60, 70, 85%. 85% of you already have or are planning on it in the next 12 months. Okay, and That's a pretty strong number. And, when you have and now it's up to 87 and a half, that's a large percentage of people who are saying, yes, I have content. I have to figure out how this whole cloud storage is going to take place, how I'm going to manage that, how I'm going to manage the security and access to that, the data loss prevention and governance of that. There's a whole bunch of things. It all hinges around content, where it's stored, and what kind of supporting tools and capabilities you surround for that. So let's go ahead and move to our next slide. What do all these limitations have in common? BLOBs. They're the root of SharePoint storage problems. The key thing is blobs don't change. They're immutable. They're created, they're deleted, but they're never updated. So that gives them some unique operational characteristics that we can take advantage of as we move forward. So understanding the blobs are driving the limitations, like all 5 of these we talked about and many others, there's not really a silver bullet, but there really is. You can move the blobs outside of SharePoint and get all the management benefits that you are seeking, but avoid all the headaches that come with managing large unstructured content. Let's put it in perspective here. So we talked about that terabyte database backup taking 8 hours. If you take an RBS solution and you move out your unstructured content, about 95% of what's in SharePoint, you have a terabyte shrinks down to 50 gigabytes. How long does it take to back up 50 gigabytes? Can you back it up more frequently? Can you meet your RPO objectives well into the future? That's a pretty powerful thing when you can look at that and say, I can solve a lot of my problems, in terms of users getting access to the content faster, being able to back it up, being able to manage these limits within StoragePoint around file size and around database. That's a really powerful thing. So let's just kind of recap. We talked about 5 things: content database size, file limits, backups, compliance, and cloud. If you externalize your content and you choose the storage tiers and you save the money in the process and you automate that because nice little rule system, we can solve all of these limits. Okay? Any file size, essentially any database size, super fast backups that meet all your requirements. Compliance, mandates for speed, type, duration, however long we're keeping track of it. So basically, RBS is going to do several things for you. It's going to give you the ability to leverage commodity storage while preserving the performance characteristics. That's huge. It gives you the ability to target the right content with the right priority to the right device for storing it. If you have any kind of regulatory or governance issue, it's going to allow you to support those and meet any of those objectives without feeling a lot of pain. And then ultimately move content between the storage tiers as it naturally ages. Now, one little plug here. Metalogix has the leading RBS or externalization tool called StoragePoint. StoragePoint does what we've been talking about today, does it very well, and it does it with some of the largest corporations in the world, but also it's ideally situated for those who are much smaller in nature as well. So highly recommend you check that out if you're having some storage challenges here. Now, just a lot of times when you go to ask for budget to buy something new and they don't realize you're going to be saving lots of money other ways because of that, here's some anecdotes that you can use to help people understand what you're talking about. You don't have to be totally technical for these points to hit home. Okay, StoragePoint acts as a traffic cop because it directs all the content and the traffic to different locations as needed behind the scenes. Nobody knows what's going on. It does it seamlessly. Manages all of the encryption. It manages all of the widow and orphan control, all of those kinds of things. It acts as a moving van. So it literally picks up all of your blobs, moves them out of SQL Server, and drops them into a new home that's more appropriate. In doing so, it acts as a turbocharger. Okay, it literally, by shrinking the content database sizes and moving content outside, that fundamentally uses a different API to call and deliver that content to users that's about twice as fast as SQL Server, easily demonstrable, you're going to get huge gains. And if you shrink your database sizes by 50x, what does that do? It does a lot of very positive things for performance and backup management. And then finally, in doing so, it declutters SharePoint. It gets all that stuff out of there, allows your job as an administrator in proactively administering the system, your farms, your site collections, everything out there, makes it just that much easier for you. So what can you do next? Well, there's a couple things. You can go out to get a couple of free assets that might be very beneficial for you. One is an MVP guide to optimizing storage and performance by Michael Knoll, one of the SharePoint MVPs. And you can get this at the Metalogix.com website just by searching on optimizing storage. We also have a free tool called the Blobulator. This is an excellent way for you, without touching your system, just download the Blobulator and you can go ping your SharePoint environment and find out how much benefit you would get by externalizing your content. It'll show you by the databases, it'll figure out how much blobs are taking up and what you would actually be able to do by putting it out external to StoragePoint or to SharePoint. And if you like that, then what you might want to do is just go download some free trials. We've got a SharePoint backup solution that is tightly integrated when used with StoragePoint and StoragePoint itself. Both of these are free to give a try. And if it looks like it's a good fit for you, you may be able to solve a lot of limitations very, very quickly. So with that, I would stick to no limit on SharePoint. Don't play poker with these guys, a whole different kind of no limit. These are some of my favorite players out there, and they're doggone good. You guys are the best at SharePoint, and so I would stick with it and nail it on the SharePoint side. So with that, I really want to thank you for attending No Limit Storage in SharePoint 2016. Play the winning hand, and I appreciate you taking time out of your day. And I hope that you got a lot, and you're able to revisit those target lessons learned up front, and that you got out of it what you were hoping to. Thank you.